Do you, Daniel Hayes, take Evelyn Carter to be your lawful wife? And do you, Evelyn Carter, take Daniel Hayes to be your lawful husband?
Evelyn Carter signed the marriage license with the same steady hand she used when approving contracts for her father's foundation, but this signature felt nothing like business and nothing like choice, and the worst part was that she had stopped expecting either. The courthouse in Portland, Maine, was small and worn, with beige walls, humming fluorescent lights, and a clerk who looked as though she had witnessed every possible version of regret. Across the desk sat the man she had agreed to marry, a stranger named Daniel Hayes, 36 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in a faded navy sweater and jeans that had been carefully repaired at one knee, and beside him stood a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit whose ears had been sewn back on more than once. Her name was Emma, and she was 6. Evelyn kept her eyes on the paperwork while the clerk explained the procedure, but she could feel Daniel's attention on her, not in the possessive way she had grown accustomed to among her father's wealthy associates, but with a quiet awareness that made her unexpectedly self-conscious. 3 weeks earlier, her father had informed her that this marriage was necessary, using the same tone he used when discussing taxes or legal settlements. Richard Carter was a real estate magnate who believed every relationship could be measured in leverage, and when Evelyn demanded an explanation, he had simply said, "I owe Daniel Hayes more than money can repay." She had laughed at the absurdity of it. Her father owed no one anything unless it benefited him. Yet here she was, wearing a simple cream blouse instead of the designer dress her father's assistant had suggested, signing away the last illusion that her life belonged to her. "Do you, Daniel Hayes, take Evelyn Carter to be your lawful wife?" the clerk asked. "I do," he answered in a calm, even voice. When the question came to her, Evelyn hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second before saying, "I do," with practiced composure. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. No flowers, no guests, no photographs. Just signatures, a stamp, and a legal bond that felt strangely heavier than any elaborate wedding she had ever attended. Outside, cold Atlantic air swept through the parking lot, carrying the scent of rain and pine trees. Daniel opened the passenger door of an older silver SUV for her before helping Emma into the back seat, and the small courtesy unsettled her more than grand gestures would have. During the drive, Emma hummed softly to herself while watching the passing trees, and silence settled between the newlyweds until Evelyn finally said, "You don't have to pretend this is anything more than an arrangement." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "I wasn't planning to pretend," he replied. "Good," she said. "Because I know why my father agreed to this." "Do you?" he asked gently. Evelyn turned toward the window. "He's paying a debt." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's part of it," he admitted. "And the other part?" she asked. He glanced briefly at Emma in the rearview mirror before answering. "My daughter deserves stability, and I was told you were someone kind enough to give it a chance." Evelyn almost argued that he had been misinformed, but before she could speak, Emma leaned forward between the seats and announced with complete seriousness, "Daddy makes terrible pancakes, so I'm hoping you make better ones." The unexpected comment caught Evelyn off guard, and for the first time that day, a reluctant smile touched her lips. "I make excellent pancakes," she said. Emma nodded solemnly, as if an important condition of the marriage had finally been satisfied. Daniel's mouth curved into the hint of a smile, and something about the warmth in that small shared moment made Evelyn realize that whatever this arrangement truly was, it was already far more complicated than she had prepared herself to survive. Daniel's house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees whose leaves had turned deep shades of red and gold, and it was so modest that Evelyn initially wondered whether he had brought her to the wrong address. The 2-story home had white siding, a narrow front porch, and flower boxes that had been carefully maintained despite the late autumn chill. Nothing about it resembled the sprawling Carter estate where she had grown up, surrounded by marble floors, security gates, and rooms so large that conversations echoed. Emma bounded up the front steps, pushed the door open, and disappeared inside shouting, "We're home," while Daniel carried in the small suitcase Evelyn had packed herself because she had refused to let her father's staff participate in this humiliation. The interior was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and coffee, with worn hardwood floors, family photographs on the walls, and evidence of an actual life being lived rather than displayed. Emma tugged Evelyn toward the kitchen and immediately began explaining where the pancake mix was kept, where the syrup was hidden from her, and how her father always burned the first batch because he tried to answer work calls while cooking. Daniel leaned against the counter listening to his daughter with amused patience, and Evelyn found herself watching the easy affection between them. It was unfamiliar to her. Her own father had provided every luxury imaginable but had rarely provided himself. That first evening passed with an awkwardness that was surprisingly gentle rather than unbearable. Daniel cooked spaghetti while Emma narrated her entire school day, and when Evelyn offered to help with the dishes, he simply handed her a towel without turning the gesture into a performance of gratitude. Over the next 2 weeks, she began noticing things she had not expected. Daniel woke early to make Emma's lunch, braided her hair with remarkable competence, attended every parent-teacher meeting, and somehow managed to work from a small office off the hallway while remaining constantly available to his daughter. He told Evelyn very little about his business beyond the vague description of consulting and investments, and she assumed that meant freelance financial work that paid enough to keep the household afloat but not much more. Yet there were inconsistencies she could not quite ignore. Expensive-looking documents occasionally arrived by courier, and once she overheard him discussing a board vote with someone on the phone in a tone that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Still, his daily life remained stubbornly ordinary. One rainy Thursday evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table updating her graphic design portfolio, a career she had nearly abandoned after her father gradually cut off the financial independence that would have allowed her to build her own studio. Daniel came in carrying 2 mugs of tea and set one beside her without interrupting her work. "You used to do this professionally?" he asked. "Before my father decided it wasn't practical," she replied. He studied the designs on her screen for a moment. "These are very good," he said simply. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard because he sounded neither flattering nor polite, merely honest. "You don't have to say that," she murmured. "I know," he answered, pulling out a chair across from her. "I'm saying it because it's true." Rain tapped steadily against the windows while Emma slept upstairs, and the quiet domesticity of the moment felt strangely dangerous to Evelyn because it invited comfort. She had spent years learning not to rely on anyone, yet Daniel kept creating small moments that made that lesson harder to maintain. As she closed her laptop, she looked at him across the table and said, "You're not what I expected." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "What did you expect?" he asked. Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "Someone who needed something from me." He held her gaze for a long moment, then said in a low, thoughtful voice, "Everyone needs something from the people they choose to live with. The important part is whether what they need leaves room for the other person to breathe." Evelyn could not stop thinking about Daniel's answer. It stayed with her over the following days while she folded Emma's tiny sweaters, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and watched Daniel move through the house with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities without complaint. The arrangement was supposed to feel temporary, yet routines were beginning to form around her. Emma started asking for Evelyn to read bedtime stories. Daniel began leaving a cup of coffee outside her bedroom door whenever he noticed she had been working late. None of it felt calculated, which made it far more disarming than any deliberate charm could have been. One Saturday morning they went grocery shopping together, and Evelyn was struck by how naturally Daniel included her in small decisions, asking whether they needed more fruit, whether Emma would actually eat the cereal she was begging for, whether Evelyn preferred almond milk or regular. No one had asked for her opinion on ordinary household matters in years. Her father's world had always operated by issuing instructions rather than inviting participation. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch halfway through an animated movie, Daniel carried her upstairs with practiced ease, and Evelyn remained in the dim living room listening to the quiet creak of floorboards above her. When he returned a few minutes later, he found her studying a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It showed a younger Daniel standing beside a woman with warm brown eyes, both of them laughing while holding a toddler Emma between them. "Your wife?" Evelyn asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Claire," he said. "She died 3 years ago. An aneurysm. It happened very quickly." The grief in his voice was controlled but unmistakably real, and Evelyn felt an unexpected ache for him. "I'm sorry," she said. He sat down in the armchair across from her. "Thank you." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Daniel asked, "What about you? Were you ever close to getting married before this?" Evelyn let out a short humorless laugh. "Close? Yes. My father approved of him, which should have been my warning sign." Daniel's mouth twitched faintly. "That bad?" "He loved my family's connections more than he loved me," she admitted. "When I ended the engagement, my father spent 6 months reminding me what an expensive mistake I'd made." Daniel was quiet for a moment before saying, "For what it's worth, I think choosing the wrong person is usually more expensive than leaving them." Evelyn looked at him, surprised by both the insight and the absence of judgment. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the side table. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw a flicker of irritation cross his face. "I need to take this," he said. He stepped into the hallway, speaking in a lower voice than usual, but fragments of the conversation still reached her. "No, postpone the meeting until Monday. I don't care what the board prefers. Tell Harrison I'll review the acquisition personally." Evelyn frowned. Acquisition? Board? Those were not the kinds of conversations she expected from a struggling consultant living in a modest neighborhood. When Daniel returned a few minutes later, his expression had already smoothed back into its usual calm. "Work problem?" she asked casually. "Something like that," he replied, clearly unwilling to elaborate. Evelyn let the subject drop, but the unease lingered. Later that night, while brushing her teeth, she caught herself wondering who Daniel Hayes really was when he stepped behind the closed door of that small office. The question should not have mattered. Their marriage was still an arrangement built on someone else's debt. Yet as she climbed into bed and heard Emma laughing sleepily at something her father whispered down the hall, Evelyn realized that the answer mattered far more to her than she was willing to admit, and that frightened her more than the marriage itself ever had. The answer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table revising a branding proposal for a local bakery that had agreed to give her freelance work. Emma was at school, Daniel was in his office, and rain drummed softly against the windows. A news notification appeared on her laptop screen, and she almost ignored it until a familiar surname caught her attention. Hayes Global completes $3.8 billion purchase of Aurora Biotech. Beneath the headline was a photograph of a man standing at a podium in a charcoal suit, speaking to a crowd of reporters. The image was sharper, more polished, more powerful than the man who wore old sweaters and drove a 6-year-old SUV, but the face was unmistakable. Daniel Hayes. Evelyn's breath caught. She clicked the article and read it once, then again more slowly. Daniel Hayes, founder and majority owner of Hayes Global Holdings, whose diversified technology and healthcare investments have made him one of the wealthiest private investors in the United States. The sidebar estimated his net worth at $24.7 billion. The number felt absurd, almost fictional, yet the photograph was undeniably the same man who had made pancakes with Emma that morning and kissed the top of his daughter's head before walking her to the bus stop. Evelyn sat frozen for several seconds before closing the laptop with deliberate care. Then she stood, walked down the hallway, and stopped at the open door of Daniel's office. He looked up from a stack of documents, and something in her expression must have told him immediately what had happened. "Hayes Global," she said quietly. $24 billion. Daniel was silent for a moment, then set down his pen. "I wondered when you would find out," he admitted. Evelyn stared at him. "You let me believe you were barely middle class." "I let you believe I was the man who lives in this house," he replied calmly. "That part was never a lie." She stepped into the room, anger and disbelief colliding inside her. Why would you hide something like this? Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly older and more tired than she had ever seen him. Because money changes the way people look at you, he said. It changes what they expect, what they want, what they're willing to pretend. He glanced toward the family photographs on the bookshelf. Emma doesn't know how much I'm worth. Her friends don't know. The parents at her school don't know. I want her to grow up with a chance to be loved for herself, not for access to my bank account. Evelyn folded her arms tightly. Did my father know? Your father has known me for 12 years, Daniel said. He was one of the first investors who believed in me when Hayes Global was nothing more than a small analytics company operating out of a rented office. His expression hardened slightly. A year ago he made several financial decisions that could have destroyed hundreds of employees and investors. I covered the losses quietly to prevent a public scandal. Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her understanding of everything. So this marriage was payment? Partly, Daniel admitted. He offered it because he believed you needed protection from the fallout of his mistakes, and because he believed Emma needed someone steady in her life. He met her eyes directly. I agreed because I trusted his judgment about you, even when I didn't trust much else about him. Evelyn looked away, her mind racing through every grocery trip, every shared dinner, every late-night conversation. You could have told me the truth, she whispered. Daniel's voice was gentle. Would you have treated me the same way if I had introduced myself as a billionaire? The painful honesty of the question left her without an immediate answer. After a long silence, she shook her head once. No, she admitted. Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the answer without triumph or accusation, and that quiet acceptance unsettled her even more than the secret itself. Evelyn spent the next 3 days walking through the neighborhood in a fog of conflicting emotions. She was angry at the deception, angry at her father for manipulating both of them, and angry at herself for caring so much about a man she had been determined to keep at a distance. Yet every time she tried to focus on the money, her mind returned instead to smaller things: Daniel kneeling beside Emma to tie her shoes, the coffee he left outside Evelyn's door when she worked late, the way he listened when she talked about design as though her dreams mattered. The billionaire had been hidden, but the kindness had not. On the 4th morning she came downstairs before sunrise and found Daniel standing at the stove making pancakes while the house remained quiet and gray with early light. He looked up when he heard her enter, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the mug of coffee he placed in front of her without asking. I've been trying to decide whether I can forgive you, she said finally. Daniel nodded once. Fair. She took a slow breath. The problem is that every time I remember the lie, I also remember that these last 2 months have been the safest I've felt in years. Something softened in his expression, but he remained silent. I don't care about the $24 billion, Evelyn continued. I care that Emma runs to me when she has a bad dream. I care that you treat me like my opinions matter. I care that this house feels more like a home than the mansion I grew up in. Daniel leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on her. What are you saying? He asked quietly. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. I'm saying I want to stay, she answered. Not because of the money. If anything, the money makes this more complicated. I want to stay because somewhere along the way this stopped feeling like an arrangement. Daniel was very still. Then he crossed the kitchen slowly and sat down across from her. I was hoping you'd say that, he admitted. I didn't want to ask for more than you were willing to give. A faint smile touched Evelyn's lips. You're asking now. Then yes, he said softly. I'm asking now. Before she could respond, quick footsteps sounded on the stairs and Emma burst into the kitchen clutching her stuffed rabbit. Are the pancakes burning? She demanded. Daniel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Not yet, he said. Emma climbed onto her stool and looked suspiciously between them. Why are you both smiling weird?" Evelyn laughed for the first time in days, and the tension that had been wrapped around her chest since the courthouse finally began to loosen. 6 months later, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Evelyn sat at the same kitchen table reviewing the contract for her first major independent design client, a national organic food company that had chosen her work through a competitive submission process. Emma stood beside Daniel at the stove proudly flipping pancakes under close supervision while sunlight streamed through the windows. Daniel glanced over his shoulder at Evelyn. "You're really taking the contract?" he asked. Evelyn held up the signed agreement. "Already did." Emma grinned triumphantly. "Mara signs everything really fast," she informed her father, then frowned. "Wait, your name isn't Mara." Daniel chuckled. "No, but apparently your stepmom still signs important papers quickly." Evelyn shook her head, laughing as Emma returned to the pancakes. Daniel's eyes met hers across the warm, noisy kitchen, and in that look was something infinitely more valuable than the fortune he had hidden from her: certainty, partnership, and the quiet joy of two people who had finally chosen each other freely. The arrangement had begun with a debt, but it had ended with a family, and as Emma proudly carried the first unburned pancake to the table, Evelyn realized that the richest thing in the room had never been Daniel's billions at all.